This is episode 288 of Jumblethink.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Jumblethink, where we interview dreamers, makers, innovators, and influencers all about their journey of turning dreams and ideas into reality. Along the way, we're going to share some tips on how you can turn your own dreams and ideas into reality too. On today's show, we're talking to Buster Benson all about the art of productive disagreement. Never miss an episode of Jumblethink. How do you do it? Subscribe to the show. Head on over to your favorite place to listen to podcasts, search for Jumblethink, and click subscribe. For our friends that like Apple Podcasts, all you have to do is go on over to jumblethink.com/iTunes, and for Spotify, jumblethink.com/Spotify. Now let's jump into today's conversation. Hey there, welcome to Jumblethink. My name is Michael Woodward. I am your host. We have a killer conversation with Buster Benson lined up for you. It's coming at you in the next few minutes. Before we do that, I wanted to remind you that we just kicked off season 4 of Jumblethink. I'm super excited about this season. If you missed it last week, we did something very different. It's something new. It is a preview episode, a trailer, a little teaser, a backstage pass into what we are working on for season 4 of Jumblethink. You should go check that out. You're going to hear some clips for upcoming guest interviews and a lot more. We also released our first episode of season 4. That was with Jen Lederer. She's a comedian. She had an abnormal journey to finding the world of comedy. It's a super, super fun conversation. You're going to want to check out that and the preview episode. And then later this week, we have an interview we've been working on for a long time. It is with LeVar Burton. Yeah, LeVar Burton from Reading Rainbow and Star Trek and much, much more. Super fun conversation. You're not going to want to miss that, so make sure to check that episode out later this week. That leads us to today's conversation. It is with Buster Benson. He has a brand new book out today. Yes, November 19th. It is launching today. The book's called Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. Super cool book. I am loving it. I think you're going to love it too. He has also worked as a team leader for Twitter, Slack, Patreon. And when I think of a thought leader, I think of a person who really discovers or dives deep into topics to learn more about them and unravel the mysteries. One of those mysteries that Buster specifically has worked really hard on is cognitive bias. He has a cheat sheet on cognitive bias, has over a million reads. There is so much more I could tell you about Buster, but instead we're going to just go ahead and jump into this conversation. So let's join our conversation with Buster Benson. Our guest is Buster Benson. Buster, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
I've got to start the interview with something that popped out to me as I was doing research. And I love your About page because it's not only visual, but and it's got some cool mapping of birth and all of that kind of stuff. But it's also done in a way that I've never seen before. But what stood out to me as I went through is that Buster Benson isn't your original birth name. There seems like there wasn't a story there on the paper, but it's like Eric Keith Benson, Buster Butterfield McLeod, I'm guessing, and and now Buster Benson. I've got to hear this story.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's. I can take up the full hour too. So let's see. I'll give you the short version, which is, I was coming out of college as a liberal arts major. I jumped right into the tech world with working at Amazon. And went on a wild roller coaster with them. Eventually, got married and eventually got divorced. And I was feeling like I was, in my late 20s, and like I feel like I'd experienced a lot, but I just needed a break, right? Yeah. And so I decided to take a vacation from my identity by changing my name. It was a whimsical idea that I decided to actually act upon the next day, and went to the courtroom and said that I was, I sort of crowdsourced my name from all of my friends and chose Buster Butterfield McLeod as my new name with the intention of only keeping it for a year and then moving back. Of course, it's a lot more work to change your name on every, registry of the world, including like your birth certificate and your passport. And so I ended up keeping it for, I think, almost 4 years. Wow. And when I got married again, I changed my middle and last name back to Keith Benson. So it's Buster Keith Benson now. And yeah, it was definitely, an interesting art experiment. That's sort of how I saw it was, what would happen if you change something that seems so fundamental to yourself? Like, would I change or would I not change? And so it was definitely, I can't necessarily recommend it to people, but it was an adventure.
Well, okay, there's so many questions here, and I don't want to stay here too long because there's way more incredible stuff to talk about. But I know you said you crowdsourced the name Buster Butterfield, and that in itself is kind of cool. Where in the world did that come from?
So each name came from a different source. It was really hard to choose a first name because, there's just so many to choose from, and I needed a reason to do it. I couldn't, no matter what, it was really the reason that was the hardest thing to find. And so one night I had a dream that I had opened a new cafe called Buster's Cafe, and I was like, all right, that's the reason. I'm going to change it to Buster. As for Butterfield, I was always a fan of Stuart Butterfield, who I eventually ended up working for at Slack. And I loved his last name, Butterfield. So that was in the ring for candidates. And McLeod was another name that was thrown in the ring by a friend of mine who loved that name. It was a Scottish, old Scottish name. And so there was a bunch of these names in the hat, and went to the courtroom and flipped a coin between Butterfield and McLeod to be my last name, and it landed on McLeod, and so I made Butterfield the middle name. But yeah, it was really, that's the extent of the thinking that went into it.
I have one more question about this, and then we're going to move on. You said, you went into this experiment kind of saying, I wonder what I'll learn from this. Do you have a big takeaway? Was there a big takeaway? Did it change you?
Yeah, yes, it definitely did. It was a crucible of identity for sure. To articulate it, it's tough because, one of the weird things about it is that I think that we think of ourselves in a certain way. Like, our brain has a belief about ourselves. And when you just move the pointer of yourself to a different location in your brain, it sort of has to rethink everything. And it had to rewire, who am I? What are my values? And people also, just the act of changing my name made people think of me differently, I think, which then, changed how I was. And so it really was this reinforcing event where, it was sort of taking reinvention as a game or as an art form and seeing what happened. And by doing that, I ended up changing. I opened a new business. I opened an art gallery in a bar in Seattle, named McLeod Residence, and, met a whole group of new people. And, so by the time it came to change it back, I didn't want to force everyone to change their first name version of me back to the old one, because that had been the hardest part of the whole thing.
Wow. One other thing that stood out to me is that I'm a big fan of bucket lists, life lists. You have one for 2076. Do you remember what that is on the website?
Yeah,
what is
my
it?
100th birthday. My 100th birthday. So my goal, and this is my only goal in life really, is to ride a bike around the block on my 100th birthday.
So cool. So cool. Well, I think this gives a good foundation for the rest of the interview. You've written a book called The Art of Productive Disagreement. We're going to talk a lot about that. We're going to talk about your cognitive bias sheet, the cognitive bias Kodak, and our Codex. Which one is it? I never know. Codex. Okay. And we're going to talk a lot more, but identity and belief really inform so much of what we do. Mm-hmm. You've written a thing called the Codex Vitae. Is that right? And it's about belief. And I know that so much of what you do comes from a foundation of bias and then understanding each other through that. Mm-hmm. So talk to us a little bit about belief and identity and how that's the foundation. And it seems like the spark for the journey you've been on that's led you to this book that you've written. Yeah,
it is all linked up in a weird way. I got the idea for the Codex Vitae from Robin Sloan's book, Mr. Penumdrum's 24-Hour Bookstore, I think it's called. Something like that. But it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And the idea is that a person writes a book during their life of everything that they've learned. And when they die, it's published. And I just love this idea of trying to capture in real time what you're learning. It can be a living book that, once you die, the book is sort of done. And one day, again, sort of these weird, whimsical thought experiments, I was like, what if I tried to write down all my beliefs and I published it and then I tracked it over time so that as my beliefs changed, I can actually see how they evolve. And so it started off really short. There was probably 30 or 40 beliefs on there, just like randomly, like, what do I believe about God, about aliens, about, super intelligence, all these other things that just randomly come to mind when you start thinking about belief. And then over time, adding things like political perspectives, all these things, because instead of reacting to the world that's happening, I sort of had this idea that I can always refer back to my beliefs and act proactively from there. And so it helped me be less anxious about the things happening in the world by saying, like, okay, well, before I can really get mad about this thing happening, I should consult myself and see, like, what do I actually think should be done, and make sure that I'm clear on that before I just bash on somebody else. So yeah, it is all, from sort of the beliefs to tracking my life to thinking about bias to ultimately becoming obsessed with argument and disagreement. They're all part of the same path of, like, how do we sort of communicate better with ourselves and with others.
I love the tagline for that, the living and dying record of my beliefs. How have your beliefs changed? It's one thing, I guess, to say, I believe this. It's another thing to actually document and track the patterns and shiftings and evolution of belief. And I love what you said a moment ago, where you were saying so many people are responding. And I think that's even hyper level now with the politics in America, with the divisiveness of beliefs, that it seems like most people are responding instead of actually saying, well, what thoughtfully do I actually believe for? What do I stand for? Not what do I stand against?
Right.
How do I build my beliefs instead of react to situations or others' beliefs? And I'm curious, how or what have you learned through that process of tracking your beliefs and the changing, shifting, reforming of those as you've been purposeful and proactive about what you believe and how that informs you?
Yeah, this is a really interesting dynamic, because the first thing you notice if you try to do this is that you don't know what your beliefs are. And this became clear to me when I was studying cognitive bias too. There's this phenomenon known as Mott and Bailey, which is like, you have one belief that's easy to defend and another sort of inferred belief that is really hard to defend. And when someone attacks the really hard to defend one, you just retreat to the easy one and stay there. And oftentimes that's one is not even something that they disagree with. So it's sort of this insincere approach to defending beliefs, because so when you write down your beliefs, though, you realize that you basically have to write down the real beliefs that you have and that you want to defend. And if those become hard to defend, you have to retreat in a more tangible, like, you can't do it insincerely. You can say, like, okay, well, yeah, I believe that, acupuncture works or something like that. And, if someone, takes that and it's like, I disagree with that. Here's some evidence. You have to change. I have to change the line in my file to change it and actually represent what I really believe. So it holds me accountable. It's definitely a tool of reflection. But what I really learned was that I don't have really deep beliefs about things like gun control, things like immigration, things like, freedom of speech, until you start to write them down. And then you're sort of forced to form those beliefs, which is great, because then you can actually stand on something and do something with that. But yeah, as far as like what has changed over time, man, I think there have been a few that I've changed, usually though in just becoming more specific by qualifying or expanding or but there have been a few where, like, especially any that are about predictions about the future, where I'm like, okay, yeah, I was clearly wrong about that because it didn't happen. But for the most part, I can be like, okay, well, I do believe aliens exist, but I don't think we're going to discover them, is like what I might add, that kind of thing.
Crazy. I love this. I find that there are a few people who are willing to do the work to go deep into these kind of things personally. What was that spark moment where you said, or has it always been a part of your life where you're like, I've got to really look at these things that matter, whether it's disagreement, whether it's belief, whether it's bias, whether it's some of these other things that you've been involved with communication and understanding and sharing with each other. What was that spark that kind of said, I want to go deep in this area. I really want to discover this for myself.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I do have like a few formative events in my life where, I think, but even as a kid, I was always trying to pin down something. I was like, I remember sitting down and like trying to write down every single word that I knew on a piece of paper. And, I was like in second grade or something. And I was just like, wow, that was really hard. And, the way that I approach confusion or ambiguity is by just like, okay, well, let's wade into it and see how far we can get. And it was really this self-reinforcing thing where I have a belief that some of my beliefs are wrong. And I also have a belief that it's okay to have wrong beliefs. And so if I really believe those things, then I should be okay publishing them. And so it's really just like sort of figuring out what they are and then acting on them in some way, seeing what happens, refining them, acting again. And, it sort of bootstraps itself into sort of what you see today. But that was probably the genesis of it. And as far as like what motivated me to do that, yeah, I remember it could get into therapy now, but like, there was a moment in my childhood where I was sort of like the butt of a joke where, everybody was in on the joke except for me. Yeah. And I was like, wow, that sucked. Yeah. I don't want to be like the one that doesn't see something that everybody else sees. And so I just try to be as open as possible about what I do see so that if someone looks at me and says like, that person is so ignorant about this, they can point it out to me like directly rather than trying to guess about it or trying to do it in a more underhanded way. So I really just want to invite people to tell me where my blind spots are, because that's my only hope in terms of, sort of uncovering these as quickly as possible.
I want to pivot here. It's not a big pivot, but was it 2016, came out with Cognitive Bias Sheet? Yeah. It's had over 1 million reads. I think that bias is something that we need to be talking more about. I think it's a lot of what informs politics right now, and media for that matter, is that we are operating from a place of deep bias, and we're operating from a place of saying, this isn't bias, but this is fact, and because it's my fact, it's absolute truth. And that's really a dangerous place to operate. You've worked for a lot of places. You started Amazon, then you've been to Twitter, Slack, Patreon. You now launched this book. Where along the line did you start saying, bias is something we need to be talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably, I really got it. I mean, there was this Wikipedia page that has a list of all these biases, and I was just referring to it a lot in my conversations, especially at Twitter, actually. So this is like 2012, 2013, and I was a product manager, and my job was to basically make promises to leadership and then fulfill them. And I think that this dynamic is a really good one to become interested in biases from, because it's not enough to be right. Like I could be the product manager's like, this is how you should do it. This is the strategy. But if it doesn't actually pan out, then it's all for naught. And actually it's the panning out part that's hard. So yeah. If you're in a case where you're being held accountable to results, you have to open yourself up to learning about your blind spots and learning about what you don't know. And that's what really became apparent to me. I became frustrated that it was so hard to understand bias, because there's just so many of them. There's 200 plus of them. They all have different names. They all overlap and sort of some of them have been disproven. Some of them have been so it's just like a jumbled mess. And so my goal was to simplify it to the point that I could remember it and act on it again. So that's what really got me into it, where it's like, when you're being held accountable for results and not just for opinions, then you need to be aware of your biases.
Well, I remember reading through the article that you wrote about it, and you were talking about how you went to Wikipedia, and you used that word jumble there. We like the word jumble. I mean, it's in our name. Oh, sure. So we'll just kind of stay there. Yeah. Wikipedia had all this stuff, and it was confusing and diluted and really hard to assemble that. You've taken these broad strokes of bias and you've categorized them to an extent, but also put, I don't want to say response patterns, but ways to actually understand them better, I guess is a way to say it. Talk to us a little bit about that and how you were able to see from the big picture that was a mess and bring kind of some thought and cohesion there.
This is something that I love to do, take something that makes no sense and, try to, because in order for it to be in order for me to integrate it with my belief system and my worldview, I have to understand it, and that means reformulating it in my own words. And so I had about a 3-week period. My second son was born. I was taking time off work, and I was just like, I need something to keep my brain alive during this time, because like most of the time I'm like snacking and napping and just cleaning up messes. And so this was what I sort of focused on. I was like, I'm just going to think about this, and I did it just by like brute force reading every single bias, putting it into a spreadsheet, trying to find patterns. I probably wrote that post 20 times before I posted it, because the first 10 are attempts that fail, and eventually just got simpler and simpler just by through repetition and sort of like seeing it from different angles, until I was able to track it back to like these 3 or 4 problems that our brains are trying to solve, which are like, there's too much information in the world, there's not enough meaning, there's not enough time, and it's really hard to know what to remember and to apply to the future. So, when I saw those 4 problems as being addressed by each of the biases in a different way, I started, an aha moment came for me, which is like, oh yeah, those are the problems that they were evolved to solve, and those are hard problems that we can't solve, so we need them to an extent. These are the shortcuts we take to think at all, to get anything done at all in the day, and in that sense, they're really valuable.
How do you define cognitive basis? I guess we should have done that a couple minutes ago, but for some people listening, they might be going, well, I know what a bias is. What are they talking about here?
So yeah, we're all familiar with a few, like, confirmation bias is one of the more popular ones, where we tend to like see information that fits into our, beliefs, and we tend to ignore information that, might disconfirm it. And, that's useful in some contexts where you're really trying to make an argument, right? But it's really harmful if you're in a classroom where you're trying to understand what's going on, really, if your brain is automatically removing like some of the most important information from your view. So a bias is a shortcut that our brain takes that helps us process information in a way that's really doesn't require a lot of thinking or energy, because that's a really heavy process. And by taking this shortcut, it does some kind of first order tool for us. It helps us in some way, but it also tends to make the same kind of mistake over and over again. So like, there's a lot of biases where we tend to favor the familiar, or we tend to, look for things that are bizarre. And those are good things to do, but it also means that we undervalue, the things that are not familiar, or the things that are sort of boring or dull, in a systemic way that over time piles up and becomes a problem.
Why does this matter? Why is this such a problem for us as individuals in society?
Increasingly now, it's a problem because the amount of information coming at us is growing, right? So when we have more of a problem of too much information, we have to lean on these even heavier, and we actually build up infrastructure to help us filter, like all of the things that we use to filter information for us, like which people we follow on Twitter, what the algorithms of Facebook sort of deem to be in front of us, what channels on TV we watch, which papers we watch or listen to and read, what books we read. All these things have already done a lot of the filtering for us. And so if our only goal is to reinforce our beliefs, we're really now carving off a really sort of isolated slice of the total picture. And we end up having a view that isn't fully informed. And, when we're all trying to talk to each other and none of us is fully informed or even like partially informed about the other side, it leads to all kinds of communication problems, to say the least.
I could go hours talking about this. I think it's something that we need to do more of, especially with the climate that we're in. We've got to pivot towards the end of this first segment. We always ask, though, how are you finding purpose in what you do?
Yeah, I started with this question, with like, what is the thing I can do with my time and attention that will, have the greatest positive impact on sort of the current world situation, coming out of, this sort of like realization that the world is very polarized right now and a lot of things are unproductive. It's a hard question to answer. We can start. I can run for office. I can start canvassing. I can start being an activist. I can do all these other things. But I was really trying to find the thing that would be the biggest sort of, I guess, bang for the buck in terms of what's not being sourced, like what's not being worked on that I can work on that's like I'm uniquely suited for. And so my purpose is really just to improve the quality of the conversation of the world, because I think that until we can have a conversation about disagreement, things we disagree about, like we can't solve any of the problems. We're not going to actually start working on the problems until we can talk about them. And I sort of see it as an existential threat that if we don't solve this, we're not going to be able to, we might die of the silliest thing because we just can't talk about it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
What is one challenge you're currently working to overcome?
Let's see. I'm really trying to overcome this. What is the seed that I can speak to that opens people's curiosity about this topic? And I try to take a very playful, lighthearted approach with the book. Like lots of illustrations, a lot of anecdotes and stories. But like it's still hard. It's still hard to shift the conversation from, how do I hurt the other side to how can I learn from the other side? And finding the right seed for that conversation is something that I think has to be personally curated for each individual person, to the extent that we're all at a different point in this conversation and sort of aware of different things going on. So how do I, if I can do it with one person, can I do it with 10 people? Can I do it with 100 people? And sort of moving up from there.
And finally, what's the next big goal you have?
The next big goal I have, let's see. Well, personal, professional, relational. I left the tech world about a year ago, and to focus on writing a book and sort of thinking as a creator instead of as the creator of platforms for creators. And my next big goal is to figure out, what is the sustainable place for me in the world. And, so I think that's one of them. It's like, right now I'm just like living off of the savings I've accumulated, but I want to be sustainable.
We're going to take a break right here. And when we get back, we're going to talk about Buster's new book and a whole bunch more. We'll be right back. In a moment, we'll be back with our conversation with Buster Benson. I'm going to take a moment here and ask for your help. I want you to think about that dreamer, that idea maker in your life, the person who's always talking about someday, one day, that they keep being held back by something, but and they know that they're created for so much more. Would you share today's show with them? Or maybe share your favorite episode of Jumble Think with them. Means the world to us that you would listen. So thanks for taking the time to share our show with that friend, that family member, that coworker, that big dreamer, that idea maker in your life. Now let's jump back into our conversation with today's guest, Buster Benson. We are back with Buster Benson. We've got to know, how can people find and connect with you?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find on the internet these days. I'm busterbenson.com is my website and has all the information about the book. And then @Buster on Twitter is good for just, pinging me with questions or, thoughts. So yeah, I'm or you can just search for me. I'm everywhere.
We'll have those links in the episode notes so you can swing on over there. Buster has a new book out called Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. We're entering Thanksgiving, so there's a lot of people already thinking about the Thanksgiving dinner table and the conversations they have. I love that you are all in on this book. You've had a successful career in tech, and you stepped away from all of it to say, I'm all in, I'm focused on this book, I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. That must mean it's pretty important to you. Why is this conversation about disagreement and productive disagreement so important to you?
It was a slow realization. In fact, like when I started writing this book, I had a full-time job and I was, had a newborn baby and all these other things. And I was like, hey, I'll do this like on my commute and, on the weekends. It became really clear to me as I dove into it, like number one, how broadly disagreement applies to our life. Like it's in every single nook and cranny of our life, from how we talk to ourselves to how we talk to our spouse, to how we talk to our children, how we talk to our parents, how we talk to our bosses, teachers, strangers, community members, everywhere. Everywhere we go, conversation is the social tool that we use to make progress. There is no app for resolving disagreements.
Right.
And, no matter what your job is, you have meetings, you have phone calls, you have emails, And these are all about communication, firsthand words, using conversation to compare notes about what you think about the world and hopefully get a little bit smarter. So as soon as I saw how like widely applicable it was and how it also operated as a meta skill in terms of like, if we can get better, even a little bit better at disagreeing, all of our other skills will become also better because they require communication to progress. So, and then I'm a voracious reader. I read a lot of self-help books. I read a lot of advice books, psychology books. I didn't see any books about this directly. Like there's a lot of books about how to win an argument, how to be persuasive, how to use negotiation. There's also a lot of books about rationality and that kind of stuff. But like there was nothing about the human conversation and the art of a single conversation and how to actually grow from it out there. And I don't know. And so I wanted to fill that gap.
I love that you said there's a lot of conversation about persuasion. And we love those conversations. We've had a lot of, not a lot, but we've had a few guests on that's their area of specialty. And I think we're conditioned in our culture to try to have conversations that we win. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem with persuasion often is that we're trying to convince and we're not trying to listen. Talk to us a little bit about the difference between productive disagreement, persuasive disagreement, or that process of trying to win the conversation, and unproductive disagreement. What are the differences, and what does it really mean to have a productive disagreement? What is that outcome that you're looking for there?
Yeah. I mean, so rhetoric and the skill of debate was defined, by way back in Aristotle days. Like he wrote the book on it, and the way he defined it is not that dissimilar from how Lao Tzu defines the art of war. The art of disagreement, of rhetoric, and the art of war are both to use whatever means possible to get the other side to concede defeat, right? And so I see rhetoric and persuasion as sort of evolving out of our art of war and sort of the battle military strategy of our culture, and just using words instead of swords, right? And so, in that sense, a productive or a high quality rhetorical conversation is one that you use some kind of means to get them to your side. That might be threats of force. That might be appeals to reason, higher authority. That might be just like wearing them out and using exhaustion as a way. There's a lot of strategies that you can use. I distinguish, the art of productive disagreement from that by saying, the goals are different. Those are if your goal is to merely, get someone on your side, you can use force and you can use rhetoric and you can use these things. But if your goal is to, in the process of having a conversation, also grow as a human, also see the world, in a more expansive way, of connecting with people more of enjoying company more, of seeing the world as a bigger place, then you need a different approach. And I outline 4 fruits of disagreement that can sit alongside the one that we're familiar with, which is like being right. And those are insight about the world. So if someone is if you're disagreeing with someone, you can use their perspective of the world to gain information about their perspective that you can add into yours. And it's like, okay, well, now I understand the world is bigger than it was before, and I understand it a little better. There's connection, it's like building relationships across, different divides. There's enjoyment, which I think is one of the most neglected ones. And like, what if we went into all of our disagreements with the expectation that they should be enjoyable? I think we would approach them very differently. And ultimately, like, learning about the world, being in the flow of a conversation and stretching a little bit is super enjoyable. That's how enjoyment is defined. And then security, is the side effect of the other 3 of like, once you've used this tool of conversation to gain insight and get connected with people and enjoy it in the process, you're actually going to feel a little bit less anxious about the world because it's a little bit safer and that person's on your side a little bit more. So those are 4 things that I think make it a much more richer process than merely, the black and white whose side wins kind of outcome.
It almost seems like the perspective moves from, and you use that term with some of the examples you give about that war mentality of fight, whether it's through logic or through battle or however those 4 areas actually are applied, to a more hopeful outlook in our touch with each other, our our exchange with each other. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, I think we don't see people. We understand how stereo vision works, where like we have two eyes in order to see the world in 3D. We can think of people as like other pairs of eyes that can help us see the world in more dimensions. And the farther away they are from us, the more actual nuance we can end up seeing by having the stereo vision of their perspective. And that's a different goal entirely than getting them to shut their eyes entirely, right?
You, in the book, talk about 8 things we can practice to improve the art of productive disagreement. I love practical tools that we can apply to what we're doing, because so often we talk theories, but we don't actually say this is how we do it. We talk about ideas, but we don't actually put it into practice. Talk to us a little bit about creating a culture in which we can practice these instead of just saying, oh, great conversation, productive disagreement. We should talk about that. We should know about it. We should be aware of it. Well, that still doesn't actively change people until people put into practice the theories, the ideas, the concepts behind it. So talk to us a little bit about practice areas and how we can start moving into productive disagreement, into the place of healthy exchange.
Yeah. I mean, we all know that we should, if we want to be healthy physically, we go to the gym, and, going to the gym is like practicing, exercising our muscles, and by tearing our muscles a little bit, they become stronger. Yeah. I'm just advocating that we approach conversations the same way. We have to, and everyone's at a different level. You might not go to the heaviest weights in a conversation, if you haven't, been practicing. But so these 8 things to try are things that you're meant to use in everyday conversations, to practice that and find that flow sort of moment where you're being stretched a little bit and you're forced to grow a little bit, and by doing that you become a little bit better for the next one. So it starts. They all go in sequence in terms of I guess difficulty. The first one being just paying attention to anxiety, and each chapter sort of brings together a lot of experts and books that speak to each of these areas in way more detail. But I try to synthesize that into the practical tip of like starting a disagreement journal and paying attention to that anxiety as a signpost for some belief that you have, some value that you have, so that you can then see, like, is that really threatened? You can talk about the value itself instead of about the thing the feeling of being threatened. And so I sort of go through these 8 things. One of them is like speaking for yourself instead of for others, which I think is a really useful one, because so often we just speak for other people and we put words in other people's mouths instead of inviting them to speak for themselves, and also like speaking from our own perspective about this. Like oftentimes we feel like we're representing a demographic or an ideology, and they're representing theirs, and it's not about the people, it's just about these larger forces. So making it personal, and if you're talking to someone about someone and they're not in the room, that's a problem. We should try to pull people into the room that can speak for themselves about what we are confused about, and so those are a couple. Another one is building arguments together. This is one of my favorites. Once you sort of see disagreement as a enjoyable thing you can do, is you don't have to necessarily only attack arguments. Often I see is like, hey, try to prove it to me, try to convince me. What if you just took the other side and try to convince yourself, right? Build up the argument as high and as strongly as you can. Invite the best opponents that can best speak to the other side's positions, and see if it can topple your belief. In the process, you're actually having an argument, but you're, instead of saying like, oh, this is my point, how does your point respond? You could be like, how does your point, how would it respond to this flaw I see? How can we help it sort of do so in a better way? And it's really fun to do because it involves sparking your creativity, and ultimately you get to explore an idea space that you haven't been in before.
It's great to have this perspective. I know for me, I try to go into conversations, whether it's people when I was running our agency and we had a team meeting, or whether it's a client that I'm meeting with, I try to have this kind of approach where we can disagree, where we can have different opinions, but we're making sure that the other side's heard and that we process through an outcome and a solution that works for the situation we're facing. But it takes 2 to tango, as they say. So What do you do when you go into situations where you're on board, but the other people around you might not be?
Right. Yeah. This is a common, most arguments start this way, right? or devolve in this way, where one person is being sort of ranty and other person's either being ranty or trying to be nice, and then, eventually loses patience and leaves, right? So if someone is just railing into you about a position, the question I usually like to ask is, what is it about your position that you think I'm misunderstanding? Or, can you tell me a bit more about where this belief came from? Because I'm not quite there yet, right? Obviously, I'm not quite there yet. Help me get there. Help me understand what I don't see. What am I missing is a great question to ask. And, that's an invitation, right? That's an invitation to sort of step off the battlefield and be like, okay, well, here's the background that will help you sort of see my view a little bit more clearly. If they continue ranting and, aren't interested in sort of stepping off that dynamic, you can always even step another step back, which is, what will it take to opt into this conversation? So you can say, like, I would like to have a conversation about this. If you're willing to, if now's the right time, or maybe now's not the right time, or you can suggest another venue. Do you want to have that with me right now, or would you rather not? And that's an open door to, like, they could say no. They could say, no, the world's falling apart. You're the problem. I can't talk to you right now.
Yeah.
And you could say, oh, fair enough. Okay, we'll continue this later, or, have a good day, right? If they do want to have a conversation with you, now they have an invitation to take it. But, we can't assume that everyone wants to have every conversation when we do. And so adding that invitation is really important.
You've done lots of research about it. You've read tons of different sources. What was the thing that surprised you most as you researched this topic, as you explored it yourself? What caught you off guard or maybe changed your perspective the most?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind happened pretty early on in my research, which was just how much we aren't yelling necessarily. We aren't having unproductive disagreements. We are just not having disagreements at all.
Oh, wow.
So it's a very big difference between, like, I'm having all these arguments and they're just failing, to I've stopped arguing with people. I've stopped talking to people that I disagree with entirely. And even so I've tried to start a few, online groups to discuss things or diverse conversations across different positions, and getting people to participate at all is the hardest part. So it's not really even that we want to, but we just don't know how. It's oftentimes that we've stopped wanting to. And that's a really sort of sad sort of realization for me at the time. It was like, oh, wait, we've already given up. And so that changed my perspective from, like, I need to understand how to fix this, to I need to re-inspire people that disagreement is even possible in a productive way. That's like reinterest us in the pursuit of productive disagreement. And that's why it's really much about, like, accepting our emotions, accepting the fact that this is hard, accepting the fact that we need to learn this stuff, just to get us onto the page, before we can even learn about it.
You've started a couple different things. Better Humans on Medium. You're the creator of 750words.com, and you developed Fruitful Zone. All of those seem to be around conversation. How are these tools helping to bring this conversation further?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all attempts, right? 750 words is one of the, it's almost 10 years old, and this was the one that really became a catalyst for me, because I realized that the most important disagreements I had to resolve were in my own head.
Wow.
With myself. And we don't really have, as more and more information starts coming at us, we haven't remembered to carve time in the day to actually talk to ourselves and resolve some of these thoughts. So whether it's through mindfulness or through journaling or through something like that, like, we have to learn to talk to ourselves, and not only in, like, a berating, gosh, you should be better kind of tone, but, like, in the, like, oh, wow, what do you think kind of tone, and in a more kinder and gentler way. But yeah, I see everything as a conversation these days, and maybe that's just my familiarity bias happening. But if you look around, everything can be interpreted through a lens of conversation. We just use words all the time, and yes, I think there are tools that can be used to frame create the space. Like, there's a chapter on cultivating neutral spaces, and it's really neglected to the extent that we can create tools that help create the space, not the answers or not even the instruction list, but just like the space that says this is a place where it can happen. Yeah, definitely trying to fill that gap and really interested in finding places. I mean, there's a few places out there, like letter.wiki is a new one that I'm really excited about, where people just have long form conversations with each other online. There's also changeofview.com, which is about posting a position and inviting disagreement about it. And there's a few others that are sort of doing a really good job of creating these spaces that I'm excited about.
I'm going to ask a dangerous question.
Nice.
Mostly because it probably comes from my own place of bias. I've been a web developer for 13 years. We've worked with some pretty big startups and helped launch some crazy cool companies. I know that you have worked with some of the biggest in the industry, whether it's Slack or Twitter or Amazon, Patreon. What is the best way we can continue to open up or start to get back to a place of having real conversations that go beyond the filters of technology? And let me quantify that a little bit more. So much of our conversation, and that's what we're talking about, disagreement, is pigeoned into people who are like us, whether it's through proximity and people that think from face to face to social media groups that we're a part of, whether it's a Facebook group or a Twitter thread that we're following. And we see two responses. We see confirmation bias, which we've talked about a little bit. And then we see I can say whatever I want because there's no consequence. So I guess the question I'm asking, I often say that we're building false intimacy without responsibility in social media. How do we bring back the responsibility, especially when it comes to true disagreement, productive disagreement, and conversation that brings change, that brings that place of hopefulness back? How do we have these real conversations when we're painting ourselves into or putting ourselves back into a place of confirmation, of not real touch, of not real responsibility?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of interesting insights have become obvious to me as I've been writing this. One of them is that anytime things get bad, it creates pressure for something good to happen. And you can see a lot of the bad and only see the bad, but there's also a lot of good. And, the fact that podcasts are, preaching to the choir here, but like the fact that podcasts are blooming right now, and podcasts are a place where, nuanced conversations can happen between people that are, different. That's, I think, a response to the algorithmic feeds of the world, right? The fact that we are resorting back to smaller communities that, sort of bring out the full human and allow us to be our real selves, and that we're, sort of speaking about these things on YouTube or on podcasts, that's great. And I think that the answers are already unraveling and unfolding into our ecosystem. They're early. They're definitely nascent. And, there's going to be this whole other wave of what happens when business models have to sort of pay for all this. And what happens when the big incumbents try to snatch it all up, But for now, I think, podcasts where long form discussions can happen and, are invited and are great. Public blogging kinds of situations were coming back where you could just post long discussions and backs and forths with people that you disagree with. The fact that there is a market for a book about productive disagreement is a sign that things are improving. So I like to think that there's a pendulum. The pendulum right now has really pushed us all the way to the extreme of contextless arguments floating in space, poking each other like little swords. And we will respond by generating new things that fill the gap, right? And I think the podcasts are a big part of that.
We're going to pause here, and when we come back, we are going to do our rapid fire questions. We'll be right back. We are working hard to bring you some incredible things in 2020. We want to keep you in the loop. Best way to do that, head on over to jumblethink.com, sign up for our newsletter. That way you are the first to know about everything exciting happening at Jumblethink. So head on over right now, jumblethink.com, sign up for that newsletter, and let's connect. And now let's jump into rapid fire questions with Buster Benson.
Levez seulement le bras pour mettre l'aiguille sur le disque.
We are back with Buster Benson for rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, our first question is, as a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a geneticist that owned a store called Invent a Pet, which would recombine DNA to invent your perfect pet, like a turtle cat.
There are ethical questions there, but I love the concept for sure. That's pretty stinking awesome. Our next question is, what is one tip you'd give someone with a big idea or dream and they don't know where to start?
I would say private journaling. I think that self-reflection and just exploring your own internal monologue to the point that you get to the very bottom of it and argue with yourself and do all that stuff you need to do it for 30 days and something will germinate and you'll feel it a little bit better.
What is one change you would like to see in the world?
Oh, I would hope that there was less polarization on topic. Yes.
What do you want your legacy to be?
That I rode a bike around the block on my 100th birthday.
That's a pretty cool legacy.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Where do you find inspiration?
I find inspiration in nature everywhere. I think I find inspiration in the attempt to master any skill, in the attempt to have a conversation about something I never had before. It's underneath the surface everywhere.
I'm going to preface this next question with, other than your book, what is one book that every dreamer should read and why?
Oh, man. Yeah. I'm really a fan right now of Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing. It's just a beautifully written book about an interesting topic. It's not exactly about what you think it is, but it's just a beautiful meditation on just stepping back from our desire to be efficient and productive 100% of the time and finding ourselves. And just, I think it's a great book. Anyone would enjoy it.
How do you define success?
Success? Is it going to help me get around the block on my 100th birthday? It's a good one. And quality time is really the one that's my serious answer. Like, how much quality time do I have in the day with myself, with others, and with my interests? That's my ungameable metric that I try to follow.
What is one habit you find helpful in your life?
Writing every day is a big one. Going on a long walk every day is a good one. Posting stuff that is very low quality, just to make sure that no one is trying to look at you as a personal brand. Those are a couple of my favorite habits.
So this isn't a rapid fire question, but I want to follow that question up with this. I know that you've written a book, of course. Did the writing habit every day start prior to the book, or was it a side effect of the book? And when do you start writing in the day?
I don't follow strict. I have been journaling for 10 plus years, probably 15 years, but it's sporadic. It's not always at the same time. It's not always the same amount. I think that writing is 90% going on walks and 10%. 75% going on walks, 15% writing stuff that you're going to throw away, and then what's left over. 5% actually writing stuff that was going to see the light of day.
I just was listening to an episode of James Altucher's show. He was interviewing a guy named Ryan Holiday, who's just written a book. And Ryan said that walking, not for fitness, but walking for being creative, is one of the most creative things he can do to spark ideas and to clear the path for the ideas that should actually come up to the top.
Yeah. I think there's something about walking. You see nature. So hopefully if you go around anywhere that has nature around it, it gets your heart rate up, which I think is very important for creativity, to get your heart rate going a little bit faster than the resting heart rate, to spark ideas and get you excited. It's just it gets things flowing, and you get to hopefully capture some of that stuff when you get back to your desk.
What is one thing you wish you would have known when you first started out?
I think one thing that took me a while to learn that has been really valuable is that life is a long game, and not optimizing for any one game, but optimizing for the long game is important. So it means that, every job that ends up sucking, every, relationship that ends up not working out, every project that ends up flopping, don't think of them as failures. Think of them as part of the long game. It's part of try to get something out of it. And I wish I had learned that earlier, in terms of not feeling as much of a failure for some of the things that had happened earlier on in my life.
If you weren't doing what you're doing today, what do you think you'd be doing?
If I had other skills, I've started trying to play the piano. I would love to write music and play music. I would love to be an illustrator and draw kids' books. That would be really fun. I don't know. I could start a school, for kids. I don't know. There's a lot of lot of interest. Like, oh yeah, that's another timeline I could have gone down, but not this life.
Our final rapid fire question, and probably one of our favorite questions to ask, is what is one dream you're still wanting to fulfill in your own life?
I'm not going to go with my riding the bike around the block one because I've already given that for 3 answers. But I think other than that, I think I have a fear of publicity and public speaking and that kind of thing. So doing some kind of public, like a TED Talk or something, or, doing something that's, more public than everything else I've done yet, and continuing to push that a little bit further is probably a dream I have, but also like a nightmare.
As we wrap up, we always love to have our guests have the final thought. So what's your final thought for all of us today?
Good one. My final thought is, I don't know, I think approach argument and conversation as a game, as something that can be entertaining and fun, and find your flow in that and see where it goes, because I think it's step 1 unlock step 2 and step 2 unlock step 3, and we can all be much further along if we saw it that way more.
I want to thank you for taking time out and being on the show. I love where you're going and what you're exploring and the ideas you're sharing. So it's been an honor to have you share some of those thoughts with us today.
Thank you. It's been a super pleasure. I think you've asked such great questions, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
Later this week, our guest is LeVar Burton. Here is a little bit from that conversation.
Look, my neighborhood, Meadowview, some people call it Ghetto View.
Yeah.
That's where I grew up.
Yeah.
I'm from the straight up hood.
Yeah.
And I know that my mother's love and devotion and commitment to giving me a way out, an education. She always said, believed, and acted upon the belief that an education was the leveler of the playing field, and that in spite of the color of my skin, if I were educated properly, I would be able to succeed on the same plane as the white kids.
Yeah.
Right? And she was right.
Yeah.
I grew up in that kind of an America.
Yeah.
Where in spite of the deck being stacked against me, I rose.
Yeah.
Because I was programmed to rise.
And that was expected of you.
It was what was expected of me, yes. We've so lowered our standards in this country, in this culture.
Yeah.
We've lowered our standards in so many ways, big and small. And yes, we have stopped challenging our children, for the most part, to be their best by expecting them to be their best, expecting them to rise, and giving them the space and grace to do that.
There is so much more to this conversation with LeVar, and you're going to want to come back and hear the whole thing later this week. We want to thank today's guest, Buster Benson, for being on. Go check out his new book. I think you're going to love it. The links are in the episode notes. Now, here's my big takeaway for today's episode. Many of us are afraid of conversation. We're afraid of what others will think. I love that Buster is bringing up this conversation because we need to be talking. The world is so fragmented. It's divided. It is polarized beyond where it should ever have gotten to. We need to have conversations. We need to have dialogue. We need to talk about the things that are important to us. We need to stop hiding our emotions, our feelings, our doubts, and start really diving deep into conversations. The other big takeaway for me is that Buster did so much work preparing to write this book. You've got to do the work if you're going to put out great content. And Buster did the work of researching. Many people creating aren't doing the work. They're just kind of making it up as they go along. So those are my challenges for you today. Have the conversations that you know you need to have, and do the work, do the research, do the time it takes to find the answers you're searching for. As always, it's your turn. I hope today's conversation has sparked some new ideas for you, some new dreams, some new steps that you need to take. Because I believe you're created for something awesome, and I hope you believe it too. So get out there, dream big, and change the world around you.
Tirez votre attention. Cherchez la meilleure position. les bras et les jambes légèrement espacés. Étirez-vous doucement, mais complètement. En avant, en arrière, sur les côtés. Vous êtes une autre personne. Les mères de famille, les enfants, peuvent également prendre un moment revitalisant. Dans quelques mois, lorsque vous aurez bien saisi la technique et que vous serez maître de votre corps, vous pourrez vous décontracter même en travaillant.